Welcome to CTV's Capital Dispatch with Rachel Aiello.
Hey, I'm Rachel Aiello, and welcome to this week's edition of Capital Dispatch. So 3 main things happened on Parliament Hill this week that I wanted to chat about. First, of course, is Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland's fall economic statement, her little update on the state of Canada's finances. And essentially what was in it was largely leaked the day before. This is stuff CTV News also covered. We're talking about $15 billion in loans to increase the number of rental properties in Canada, cracking down in some ways on Airbnb and VRBO properties, places where they're saying that these short-term rentals should be used as long-term rentals, really aligning with some of the provinces and regions that have restrictions in place. There was also some progress on some clean tax credits, incentives for companies in there as well. But overall, this fall fiscal update from Freeland was, as some of the sources we spoke to ahead of time tried to frame this as, a really focused, more narrow, traditional return to what fiscal updates are, and less of a mini budget with big spending measures as we've seen in the past. Though, important to note, Canada's deficit is still not on track to reach balance. It's going to be $40 billion, which is in line with what the budget in the spring had forecast. And then as well, Freeland has announced, because of this economic context, they're aware, not wanting to spend, not wanting to build up inflation, trying to be really fiscally prudent, fiscally restrained. These are wordings we've heard from the Liberals in the last number of months. She's put in a new fiscal anchor, some further considerations about how they're going to try to remain on track, continuing to point to that debt to GDP ratio as their key metric, but some other parameters have been put in place, Freeland says, about how she's going to stick handle Canadians' finances. She's aware of the pinch Canadians are feeling, but also aware of the big challenges they're trying to tackle, affordability and housing. And the affordability side, largely because she was trying to not spend money, really looked at some little trinkets, some little items, more policy tinkering, that I'll talk about a bit more later on in this, about what to expect in terms of the legislation that's going to be required to move all this through. The second big story this week was Conservative Leader Pierre Poilievre and his caucus unanimously voting against a bill to implement the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. Now, there was already a free trade deal between these two countries in place, forged by former Prime Minister Harper, but Prime Minister Justin Trudeau worked with Ukraine to modernize it. The deal was signed when President Zelensky visited Canada earlier this fall, and now this legislation has come forward to implement it, essentially bring this revitalized, modernized agreement into law. But the Conservatives voted against it this week, and it raised a lot of concerns and questions. They are saying their issue with the bill is that it would impose a carbon tax on Ukraine. Now, there is wording both in the agreement and in the legislation about the environment, but specifically in the agreement, what it says about carbon pricing is that both countries would work together to promote carbon pricing, be aware of carbon emissions, wording along those lines. And as officials have pointed out, this does not impose a carbon tax on Ukraine. This does not force their hand into any climate policies, and have noted that Ukraine is already working on its plans, suggestions that it's had some form of carbon pricing in place already. So this has really raised questions from the Liberals mainly, wondering if this is a signal that the Conservatives are more broadly pulling support for Ukraine, calling this carbon tax clause or concern a red herring. They're suggesting that's a disingenuous reason to vote against this bill. And they are really wondering at this time, what is the Conservatives' position? Now, Conservative Leader Pierre Poilievre has said that they still support Ukraine in its war efforts. They still support free trade with Ukraine. They're really just fixated on this carbon pricing wording. So we'll see where this goes. We've heard from Ukraine's ambassador to Canada, and it's going to be interesting to watch as this now moves into the House of Commons study phase. While the Conservatives voted against this at second reading, it did have the backing of the other party. So we have seen the bill move forward and it will advance. And really some questions this week. It wasn't the only issue that we saw Poilievre on the defensive over, wondering what his position was. So we'll be watching kind of as that unfolds. But one of the other issues that Poilievre was questioned about this week is something that's going on in the Senate, also carbon related. There's this bill, I'm sure you've heard about it, from a Conservative MP seeking out further carve-outs to the price on pollution, specifically around farming fuels. Now, this proposal had worked its way through the House before Prime Minister Justin Trudeau came forward with that whole package around Atlantic Canada, home heating pumps. This was something separate that was already moving its way through. Right now, it's in the Senate, and it's become a quite acrimonious situation. There were allegations this week regarding how the bill is being handled and how some Conservatives were comporting themselves. So a few senators raised concerns that they were being intimidated, that the way specifically Senator John Plett had engaged in the chamber was threatening and intimidating. And then the way Conservative MP Andrew Scheer had posted out publicly available contact information about a few senators suggesting Canadians concerned about this bill get in touch with them had led to harassment online, threatening calls. The police are now investigating. Senator Plett apologized in the chamber, said he vowed to do better. Scheer's post remains up. Poilievre was asked about this week, and he was acknowledging that anyone who made a threat should be dealt with, but wasn't getting into the question of whether or not these pressure tactics to try to see this bill passed sooner were going too far. Debate continues on this bill. And so we're going to be watching this file as well to see if this is able to make it through before the House rises for the Christmas break. It's right at that last stage. Continuing debate, there's some contention still about when it will move and what that's going to look like. But it was a week where emotions and tensions were high in the Senate, specifically around this piece of legislation and what was being alleged was going on kind of around it. It's not often, usually, that we're reporting on or talking about these things going on in the Senate. You know, we've talked about many times before things getting heated in the House of Commons. But certainly this private member's bill has become a big point of conversation here on Parliament Hill.
Generations of Canadians who fought fear and cynicism with hope and hard work. Generations of Canadians who fought day after day to keep Canada moving forward. And generations of Canadians who believed, just as I do today, that in our magnificent country, better is always possible.
So that was obviously Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland in the House of Commons right after she tabled the fall fiscal update. And so the reason I picked this as my quote of the week this week is for two reasons. I think one, it was just interesting to note that she's really picked back up on this language of whether or not Canada is broken, that discourse that Trudeau and Poilievre have had already about the vision for this country and whether it's in need of repair or a more optimistic view. And I think this was also interesting because clearly this fiscal update, and there was some conversation about this leading up to it, was an important political moment for the Liberals. There was some conversation around the fact that, you know, the Liberals have been down in the polls for a number of months, and perhaps this economic update could be an opportunity for the Liberals to turn things around. Obviously, jury will still be out on whether they have achieved that. But I think what we noticed, and this seemed like a turning point or a pivot or a good example this week of a broader trend of the Liberals really being on the offensive and the Conservatives on their back heels. There were a number of instances from the Ukraine bill and what happened in the Senate to questions around Poilievre's language, around what happened at the Rainbow Bridge this week, where the Liberals were really questioning his motives, his intentions, using quite strong language in criticizing him all around this thought of his aptitude as leader. And you can see that gesture and that discourse or division Freeland is trying to raise in this quote. You know, when she's talking about cynicism and fear, she's pointing to the opposition benches and talking about hope and hard work, pointing back. So I think take note that this is really probably going to be the battle line that the Liberals are going to try to draw here, painting Poilievre in their mind as cynical. Some of the words we heard this week were about, harkening back to American style politics, bringing that here. So I really think that that's going to be the line of attack they take. And we'll see in the weeks ahead if they are willing or they are able to stay on the offensive. Okay, so what's on the agenda next week? Well, 3 weeks left in the House of Commons before MPs are supposed to rise for their holiday break. So this is really the crunch time to start seeing bills pass. What we're going to be watching for next week is Bill C-56. It was the first bill the government introduced in the fall sitting. It's that affordable groceries and affordable homes bill. It had really stalled, and the Liberals teamed up with the NDP to help see it fast-tracked. That all happened procedurally this week. So what we're watching next week is for that bill to get expedited through the remaining stages and off to the Senate. Also, Karina Gold, the Liberal Health Minister, said this week that they are going to be bringing forward the legislation that will implement the various bits and bytes from Freeland's fall economic update. So we'll be watching to see where the votes fall on that one, how the Conservatives plan to handle that in the House, what exactly is included, because as I noted off the top, there were a number of little tinkering measures that the Liberals really tried to frame as affordability focused, helping Canadians, but they were largely policy legislative. So we'll see what that entails and what kind of timeline it will take for those things to come into effect, because some of the things in that fiscal update seemed backloaded, promises now of money that would flow in 2025, an election year. And the other big question is, what's up with pharmacare? The Liberals have a deadline to introduce and pass legislation by the end of this year to set up that framework for a pharmacare program. So far, they have not tabled that bill. We know there are conversations going on behind the scenes about what that would look like, whether the two parties can come to some sort of compromise in the interim, given the short amount of time left, but still no bill and a short timeline. So we'll be watching to see what happens with that over the next 3 weeks. Thanks so much for watching.